fanatics. Another new episode here of Tinfoil Tales. I'm your host, Brandon. Got a very interesting episode here for you guys tonight. Hope you guys enjoy it. We're going to be joined by my guest, Tim, tonight. Now, Tim's message said he is a specialist in suppressed information of all kinds. And then he's also written a lot of books on various topics involved with this. He also wrote a book called The Hidden History of Humanity. That was based off a lot of the information he came across and believes it's something that people never knew about. But we'll dive into that here in a second once we bring Tim on. But for now, anyone out there listening, if you'd like to be on Tinfoil Tales, you can send an email to tinfoiltalespodcast@gmail.com. We'll get you scheduled for a future episode. I have a new book out called Shadows of Cedarville. Probably heard me talk about it on previous episodes, but if not, you can find that now on Amazon. It's in paperback or Kindle version, and an audio version will be out there very soon if it's not already out there. It's related to the Dogman phenomena, so I think anyone that's interested in the Dogman topics would definitely find this interesting to read. If you do happen to pick up a copy, please let me know what you think. It's definitely appreciated. If you'd like to help the show grow, keep sharing it around. The word of mouth, spreading it, is the best way to help the podcast, I think. You can find us on social media. Facebook is usually the spot where I'm perched up on, so that's the best way to reach me is Facebook. I do have the other socials, but I haven't quite figured out the algorithms yet to make them work. You follow us on YouTube, or if you're on Spotify, Apple, whatever the streaming services are. If you'd like to leave a review on there, leave some comments, do some interaction with us, that's always appreciated. I'd like to hear some feedback from everybody, kind of know what I'm doing. 5-star review helps the rankings. It makes it more visible for everyone if you listen on a streaming platform. So please feel free to do that. It'd really help me out. We're going to go ahead now and bring Tim on. So looking forward to this. Hope you guys are too. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. I'd like to take this time to welcome my guest tonight, Tim. Tim, thanks for coming on here and talking with me.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
A little bit about yourself.
Well, I have done research my entire life. I knew I wanted to be a writer ever since I was a little kid. I was actually planning on writing more fiction than nonfiction, but I believe strongly in verisimilitude. So I wanted to learn everything that I possibly could about the world. I won several awards in school for writing, science, speech, debate, and eventually I did prep to write a lot of fiction, but I studied a lot of interdisciplinary fields in order to write this fiction because it was going to be one of the biggest stories ever told. In the course of doing that research, I came across a great deal of information about the planet we're living on in suppressed history. And in the 90s, of course, a lot of books came out on the ancient past that were very fascinating. And I enjoyed those books. I appreciated those books. But I did wish that they could have gone further and deeper than they did. And because of my research background, and especially because in the last few years, it seems as if history itself is coming to a head, I felt that if we did get to the other side of the current crisis that we are in, and I think that there's many aspects to the crisis we're in as a species, we're actually in some ways facing extinction, that if we did get to the other side of this, that people would like to have some kind of understanding of the currents that led to these events. And I was thinking after a while that it might only be the research that I've uncovered that could honestly help people understand how everything happened in the ancient past going all the way up to the present. Because in many ways, the events of Atlantis are still affecting us right now, to this very day, to this very second. And some of that may become clear as we talk.
You mentioned Atlantis and everything. I know a little bit about it just because obviously whatever's been publicized for like TV or stuff like the lost city of Atlantis, to my best of knowledge, there's never been anything concrete officially released about Atlantis. Were you able to uncover something that actually kind of confirms the existence of it?
Oh, yes, indeed. And there's been a ton of evidence. Now, one of the things that's interesting is they use the word official. Well, in some ways, the word official deserves a kind of a breakdown. But I know some of this material, of course, will be controversial. For some people, the idea of something being official it comes from, let's say, accredited so-called authorities, But what I've found is that many of these authorities had an agenda, and their agenda was to purge every trace, scrap of evidence of Atlantis from the historical record. When you go back to the ancient historical records, they're actually much more extensive on Atlantis in and of themselves. But in terms of the evidence that's been collected, it's actually interdisciplinary. So one of the things that's a problem with Atlantis right from the beginning is that the concept of Atlantis has been thrown all over the place. I've heard researchers, first of all, just trying to move it all over the geographical map. There's some people who are trying to put it north, and some people try to put it in the Indian Ocean. Some people try to put it on another planet altogether, along with the Garden of Eden and all these other things. But the actual story that I've uncovered is an interdisciplinary story. And in that interdisciplinary story, we see the historical record converging with the genealogical record, converging with oceanographic evidence, converging with technological evidence, converging with other forms of evidence that are, perhaps strange to people, like what might be called geodetic evidence. And if you combine all of those sources together, yes, you actually are able to piece together a very viable, including, by the way, a technological component and even spiritual component. So there is tons of evidence across several different fields. And if you like, I can just begin with an overview of the story and we can just go from there.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so what I did at the very beginning of my book, Hidden History of Humanity, was take a tour of the solar system because it's very informative to do that. When we go through our solar system and take a look at all the planets, their distributions, their characteristics, we notice a number of anomalies that are very strange. And the conclusion that you reach after studying our solar system is that it appears to be wrecked. And then the question becomes, how did it get wrecked? Was it naturally wrecked, or was it the result of conscious interference? Now, there's an astronomer whose work I cite. His name is Dr. Tom Van Flandern, and he put together a theory of the most egregious strange part of our solar system, namely the asteroid belt that's between Mars and Jupiter, and came up with the idea of the exploded planet hypothesis. Now, in his astronomical theory, he was able to place that at approximately 3.2 million years ago. Now, he has a number of other data sets that match that and correspond to further anomalies in the solar system. For example, the anomalous distributions of moons. Why is it that the planets after Mars, the four gas giants, are gas giants? And his model of the exploded planet does give us the most plausible explanation for why our solar system looks the way that it does. So he next looked for correspondence in the geological record, and what he found was that he couldn't find a precise match at 3.2 million years using accepted geology. The nearest match in the geological record appeared to be at 65 million years ago, which is the time period when the dinosaurs supposedly went extinct. Now, because he was so deferential to his colleagues in geology, he hesitated to fully embrace his own theory. But as other authors, such as Joseph Farrell and myself, happen to think, the geological record is actually the one that's completely messed up. And there's tons of science I could get into on that. But the bottom line is that Farrell and myself, and who knows how many other people, agree that the geological record is inaccurate. So it's probably a case where what we're calling 65 million years ago in the geological record is actually 3.2 million years ago. In other words, that the dinosaurs actually would have gone extinct, whatever dinosaurs existed, at 3.2 million years ago, which of course is a revelation for any number of people who have so long believed that they went out at 65 million years ago. So from there, you start asking yourself, okay, so if we have this exploded planet hypothesis, what type of explanation would get us to an exploded planet? Well, it certainly seems unnatural. And one of the reasons why it seems unnatural is the distribution of debris. So when we look at the debris scattering pattern, the debris did not scatter evenly. Most of the debris went into the outer solar system, as if some weapon of some kind fired from the inner solar system towards the outer solar system. In other words, the planet did not spontaneously combust from within. So when you have that kind of hypothesis, this, along with other evidence I could go over, this could take a long time, so I'm just trying to go through the short version of the story. We are led to the conclusion that our solar system was consciously interfered with. Now, if you accept the evidence that suggests that our species, Homo sapiens, didn't begin until approximately 300,000 or to 200,000 years ago. It seems unlikely that human beings would be the intelligent beings out in the solar system wrecking it. So once you have that, then you're led to the question, who else could it have been? Now, of course, many people who listen to this type of podcast would probably be familiar with the congressional testimony stating that 57 different intelligent life forms had been identified. Now, of those, you might say, okay, there we might have some candidates. So of those, which of those do we think might most likely be involved with the history of Earth? So from there, the story turns to three demonstrable superpowers, of which we do have evidence for their presence here on this Earth. And these three groups are as follows. The first group hails from the Pleiades. And when they landed here, and I would agree with the psychic Edgar Casey on the timeline because it does all fit, this would be at approximately 210,000 BC. This would have been the Pleiadian group, sometimes referred to as the Nordic group. I know people fight over vocabulary words. I'm consciously using the vocabulary words that were in the sources that I cite for my evidence. So please understand that that's why I'm using the words that I'm using. Okay, so we have this group. They would have been about 12 foot tall on average with gold or blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin. They would have been extremely positive for the most part and masters of what I would call ether physics. I'll develop that case a little bit further as we go. And these would have been the founders of Atlantis, who in time, in Plato's account, would be referred to as the gods. So Poseidon, in the story of Plato, would have been a god, or in my version of the story, a Pleiadian from the stars. Now, in the story of Plato, he states that Poseidon, a god, mated with a mortal woman, Cleito, who had been orphaned from her parents, and spawned a demigod line. Now, the timeline for that I would place at about 30,000 BC, because that's where the anatomical records begin to reinforce all the data. So initially, what we would have had at about 210,000 BC was the upgrading of extant hominids to our species of Homo sapiens. So the Homo sapiens would have been short, looking like pretty much normal humans at about 210,000 BC. And the Pleiadians who engineered them would have towered over them. And for the most part, been again, gold or blonde haired with blue eyed, fair skin. And at 30,000 BC, when the demigods get started, this is starting to carry us into a different territory genetically. So now the demigods are tall and are giants for the most part, but they are half human and half Pleiadian. Now, the second group that I mentioned in this story is a group I call the Scanians. Now, the Scanians had elongated skulls, green-blue skin. They were apparently amphibious when they arrived here. They were also what is known in scientific terms as simultaneous hermaphrodites, capable of parthenogenesis. And breaking the scientific language down, that means that they were possessing both male and female sexual attributes capable of self-fertilization. In nature, when you have hermaphrodites, by the way, it doesn't mean that you can only reproduce by self-fertilization. You do have the option of fertilization from an outside source, but you are capable of self-fertilizing. Parthenogenesis refers to virgin births. And the reason why, of course, that's significant is because we all know our ancient mythology and how important the story of the virgin births are. Although what we're seeing in the actual historical record are beings that were naturally able to self-fertilize. So it's not so much a virgin birth because of a divinity intervening in procreation, but that was actually the way it was naturally. We get reinforcement from this from a multitude of sources, including one cited in my book, Robert Bauval, who made this statement that deep underground in Egypt, they did find effigies of the former so-called divine rulers of Egypt, and that these were people who reproduced without the use of women or the agency of women, which is basically, again, suggesting beings that were capable of self-fertilization and that they weren't reproducing sexually. That story does actually get reinforced, believe it or not, strongly as the story advances. But this group, the Scanian group, who I believe hails from the star system of Sirius, would have founded the civilizations of Lemuria and Pan/Mu. Those would have been their main bases until they were destroyed and they had to move off of those bases. And then the third group is a reptile group, as many people are probably familiar with who look at this material. And their original bases in ancient times, this would be from approximately 50,000 BC onward, would have been in the Antarctic and in the Indian subcontinent. But later, there is a new infusion of reptiles into the story as the Overlords who founded the civilization of Sumer. So the full-blood reptile group that founded Sumer was not comfortable being on the surface of the earth. They lived in nests in mountains and deep underground. There's a strong correlation between this group and volcanoes. Now, as soon as I say volcanoes, some people might think, wait a minute, didn't you say that they had a base in Antarctica? Why would you have a base in Antarctica if you love to be around volcanoes? Because in Antarctica, it has been discovered there are approximately 138 volcanoes. So the area is not devoid of volcanic activity. And of course, as many people who do this kind of research know, there has been a lot of strange activity taking place in Antarctica. But this Sumer civilization started up as sort of a new infusion after the fall of Atlantis, which I can sort of get into. The timeline does seem to be accurate for what Plato said. Plato's story, by the way, so many people talk about it as if it were an allegory, but Plato himself states he was talking about an historical record. The individual known as Crantor, Krantor, anyone can look him up, went to Egypt and verified that the story, as told by Plato, was indeed inscribed on pillars in Egypt. And there are other various historians, such as Diodorus of Sicily, one of my favorites, who also told the story of Atlantis and one of its further colonies, which may or may not come up in the story as we go. Now, the original group was very positive. I actually believe that they were trying to enlighten our species and advance us to a higher frequency and a higher way of being. But when the demigod line was presented with this option for the path to enlightenment, they rejected it. They went into the path of darkness. We see this pretty much directly in the story of Plato, because as Plato recounts in his story, this is quite graphic. He says that the 10 princes of Atlantis gathered together at the temple of Poseidon, that they sacrificed bulls. They killed them without the agency of iron, which is connoting a ritual, that they burned the bull, that they drank the blood, that they threw the blood all over the pillars, which is, kind of dark and not very positive in my view. And this is an indication to me that they had already gone to darkness. Now, we know much more about what happens as the story gets later on, but the next major historical event I want to introduce into the background before stopping, because it's really important, is the clash that took place between the group that founded Sumer and the group that was overseeing the Giza Plateau. Now, first, I'm just going to pause briefly to do a geodetic reinforcement here. The greatest structure of ancient times is unquestionably the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And as researchers have shown, this was definitely not a tomb. It definitely goes back in time much further than most people say. The time attribution of the late 2000s BC, we can now state, especially from the research that was offered by Tony Bushby, was not the building of the Great Pyramid. That was merely a refurbishing. As a matter of fact, there was a lot going on at that time of refurbishing, but it was not creation. It was just refurbishing. So the actual structure, though, is something that can tell us a lot when we look at planet Earth in its entirety. So imagine planet Earth as a sphere. Now imagine inserting a cube into the sphere of the Earth. That cube will touch the Earth on 8 specific points, which you can calculate using basic mathematics. When you do that, you will find that the Great Pyramid in Egypt rests perfectly atop one of those points where a cube would touch the surface of the Earth. Now, if you do the math and you go exactly 90 degrees west, you will land in the Bermuda Triangle. And at that point would have been what my researchers uncovered was the capital of Atlantis, which was known as Poseidonis. And again, I can talk more about sources after I finish this little overview. So there originally appears to have been a plan to create a Great Pyramid network, not saying that there would only have been 8 Great Pyramids, but that had there been these 8 Great Pyramids, this planet would have had forms of protection and enlightenment that it can scarcely imagine now. It does appear as if the next pyramid over, if you go another 90 degrees west, would have been located on Pan or Mu, and it does appear as if at least that pyramid also was completed. So there also appears to have been a temple of learning. We're getting some of this information from a gentleman by the name of Frank Joseph. I know that some people have controversies with his work, but it was just strange to me how I was seeing this story repeated and it was mathematically lining up perfectly. And you could follow through with the math on your own. You can see where the other locations are on planet Earth. But this shows that the Great Pyramid in Egypt was indeed an Atlantean legacy site. And the path to enlightenment that was being offered was done so through a 7-degree program. Now, in the writings of Tony Bushby, he wrote a book called Secret in the Bible. He was able to uncover what that 7-degree program was. I can actually talk about what the degrees were, but that's not the main point I want to get to right now. The point I do want to get to is that the Sumerians knew that the site in Giza was indeed a major Atlantean legacy site. And the reptiles and the Pleiadians had been fighting for ancient cosmic times, probably millions of years. And what I believe happened in Sumer was that Sumer was chosen for a very specific strategic location. It was a staging area for a military operation to go in and take over the last remaining Great Pyramid, which was in Egypt. I believe this military operation did take place as a war that was more intense than any war that's ever been fought on the planet that we know of. That this war took place before the very first dynasty in Egypt was even begun. This war probably lingered on in time for quite some time. And after the lingering Scanians and other Atlantean legacy people who were administering Giza were essentially shut down, many of whom had become negative and not so enlightened at the time this war was fought. There was an additional sort of aftermath war between the rival forces of Sumer. Now, people who are familiar with this part of the research know quite well that in the Sumer pantheon, there were two primary figures, Enki and Enlil, and that they each had military forces, and that these two fought with each other for control of Giza as an aftermath of this war. Once the war was over, the people of Sumer came into Egypt, and from what I've been managed to piece together, they were demanding to know what was being taught in the so-called mystery schools that existed at that time, the 7-degree path to enlightenment. And I think that the actual origin of hieroglyphics comes from this time. In other words, there was a huge language barrier between this group from Sumer and the group in Egypt. And they were thinking, we have to know what you know, but we don't understand your language at all. And so they developed this 3-level language, relying heavily on pictograms because pictures were the easiest way to communicate. So once they learned what was in that 7-degree program, I believe they gutted the mystery school program and they turned it to darkness. Now, in Bushby's work, Secret in the Bible, he does get into a lot of what was involved in the new program. And I'm not sure how anyone can listen to his description of the ritual of the trial of initiates and view that as a positive thing. Pretty much at the very beginning, you were sacrificing a bunch of animals and you're standing on their dead corpses. And then you go through them and there's wailing and there's screaming and there's all these oaths, which people who are familiar with secret societies would be well familiar with. If you ever divulge any of this, then you must vow to torture yourself this way or that way. And you go through these rites of initiation over a 3-day period, at the end of which you would have an out-of-body experience. Now, the mystery schools of ancient Egypt had a profound influence over the ancient world because many of the figures that we think of as the greatest figures of ancient times were not at all working in complete isolation, coming up with these ideas all by themselves like some Isaac Newton sitting under a tree with an apple falling on their head. No. I mean, what we find as we go back in time and look at the legacy of the mystery schools is that so many people were completely aware that there was this mystery school in Egypt. Plato, Socrates, many of the greatest figures of Greek history, all were initiated in this mystery school. Tony Bushby describes them by name and offers his evidence proving that. Matter of fact, I was just doing another podcast and I was mentioning to people, just so that people understand how much integration there really is. People talk a great deal about the Roman Empire and how significant it was to history. How many people know that the very first Roman emperor was an initiate in a mystery school? So we're talking about one government after another in these supposedly distant locations that were actually coordinated and trained at this one location in Egypt. And as my story develops in Hidden History of Humanity, the extent to which this corrupted mystery school spread its ideas around the world is far more drastic than people could ever dream. What if I could tell you that Greek mythology, that Roman mythology, that aspects of Hindu mythology, that the Jewish faith all can be tied back to teachings that came out of the mystery schools in Egypt. And that in many ways, the events that took place in Egypt during this great war that I mentioned that took place before the first dynasty in Egypt, I call it the Reptile-Scanian War, that those events have been recorded and twisted into multiple mythologies around the world and offered to people as if it was their history when it was not their history. The history of Judaism was largely a transmogrification of kings of Egypt who were portrayed to the people as if they were these great heroes of Jewish history. Many of the events in Hindu mythology trace back to the Reptile-Scanian War. There's a scholar who I offer his work, and you can see it for yourself. You see the parallels between figures in the Itihasa, which is a collective term for the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and shows you how those stories were actually taken out of Egypt and turned into Hindu mythology. Aspects of Greek mythology, crazily enough, were actually swiped from the battles of Enlil and Enki. For example, parts of the Titanomachy have been warped from the battle of the two. The two battling on the two mountains is reminiscent of two mountains in the Middle East where these conflicts were going on. So this ancient war took place, and when Sumer won, humanity was placed on a dark trajectory, mainly because of a civilizational model, which includes what I call the 3 T's of torment. Now, these 3 T's of torment are tribute, tithes, and thievery, which in modern terms, that would be taxation, donations to religious cults, and banking. All these models began in Sumer. It was a model of centralization of power, and all the events have spread from Sumer into Egypt, into Greece, into Rome, and then around the world, leading us up to the present day. So I will just pause there.
I actually was just trying to find your book. Just try and look up a little bit. Where is it available at before we keep on going?
Okay, so I've had a little bit of trouble with Amazon and just with people in general who don't like this information coming out. So it's only available at my website at Polytope Press. If you go to the duckduckgo.com search engine and enter Polytope Press, Polytope space press, my website should be the first one that comes up. And Hidden History is in the technology section.
Okay. Yeah, because I was looking through Amazon and I tried to Google it, it didn't show up, and I was like, questioning why it wasn't showing up. I was like, usually when things don't show up, it's because they don't want you to find it. So
Amazon sent me an email at one point, and they were saying, we need the specific information for your bank account so we can access it. And then I said, okay, I'm out of Amazon. And that was it. I ended my relationship with them right there.
that's interesting. I just released a book through them this past week, last week actually, and it's basically sold almost 100 copies already, but the monetary money that it says I've earned has not changed since Sunday.
Yeah, a little weird.
Yeah, I should be getting. I priced it low. It should only be getting like $1.98 for like each sell, and I've sold almost 100 books in the last like 2 days, and
Great.
It says I've only got $33 in there. I was like, that doesn't add up.
Yeah, I'm just going with my website. That way I know that the money is coming to me. And I'm hoping that people will at least evaluate my evidence and start feeling comfortable with what I'm saying.
Now, when you researched everything and you come up with these, I've heard the different, like the Reptilians, and I've heard the Pleiadians. And I don't know if you've mentioned the actual, like the Greys or whatever. I've heard before, and I don't remember the show, but I've heard it was like a war between the Pleiadians and the Reptilians and the Greys, but the Greys are basically like just a drone type of a ET. They weren't really like their own civilization. They were made by something else, supposedly. I don't know. Did you ever come across anything like that?
Oh yes, sure. But from looking at the sources that I looked for in piecing together the story of the ancient past, I don't see as much of the Greys in the ancient past. Not saying that they're not there, just saying that the evidence that I was looking at didn't show them profoundly in ancient times. It showed their presence much more closer to present times. I've heard variations of the story. I've heard that they're drones. I've heard that they used to be organic. I've heard that there are some that are still organic and there are some that are drones. And of course, with I have to be careful what I say here. There are certain technologies that are being explored currently to, shall we say, enhance a human being by making it more computer-like.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so there is a precedent for this type of thing occurring with other species.
Yeah, I know I've talked with some others too, and it's a touchy subject, especially when certain things are out there. I've had issues with conversations that I've had lately. Bring up a certain topic and my internet starts to mess up, which I always thought was kind of convenient.
Yep.
But but yeah. Um yeah, if you got more you want to keep on going, you can. I don't have anything off the top of my head. That was the first thing I thought of was like your book was missing and I'm trying like the grays and everything. Like I know that's the big mainstay anymore is like people always talk about grays and grays and grays, but like throughout history I've always heard like the Pleiadians, the Nords or whatever, the tall blonde haired ones, and then the reptilians, but you don't really hear where these grays really originated from. And then I'd watch some documentary and kind of discussed about how there used to be a great war and it was basically the reptilians against the Nords, and like the drones were just the grays kind of in the middle of it all.
Yes, I have heard some of those similar things too. But like I said, most of my research focused on these superpowers because of how profound their role was. I suppose the next place I could take the story would be to get into areas that I normally get a chance to cover in podcasts. So this would be new for anyone who's heard any of my other podcasts, which was the idea that the full blood reptiles were not comfortable with life on the surface. So to have administrators on the surface, they needed hybrids and they created degrees of hybrids. So you have the primary hybrids that most are familiar with, the Nephilim, but what are they hybrids of? And that is a question that hasn't been finally or fully or completely answered. There's a possibility that the Nephilim could be crossbreeds of Scanians and reptiles. This seems actually quite plausible in a number of different ways. One of the things that I try to do, I have a strong scientific background and mystical background. I'm completely comfortable in both arenas, and I make everybody uncomfortable because apparently people are either more scientific or they're more mystical. So when I'm talking hardcore science, the mystical people get bothered. And when I'm talking hardcore mysticism, the scientific people get bothered. But just trying to keep focused on very simple things, which is reptile anatomy. I mean, when you go back to ancient times, you look at reptile feet, you usually see the three fingers. Okay. But with a lot of these groups, we see six fingers. And it appears to me as if the native Scanians did indeed have six fingers. And it appears as if the Nephilim had six fingers. So it appears as if the Pleiadians had five fingers. So when the Nephilim have six fingers, that's one of the first questions I'm going to ask is where did the six fingers come from if they started off with three? Well, the most likely way would be to have hybrids with Scanians. Now, the other thing that's interesting there are the depictions of the Nephilim with having their fishtails. Now, some people may be familiar with that the symbol of Capricorn is technically representative of Enki, goatfish man. And they're often depicted with scales on the lower body. And this, again, appears to have been at one point a stage in the adaptation of Cyanians to this world. They apparently went through multiple changes. Now, okay, this is another part of the story, I guess, that we can get into the genetic engineering aspect of it. So it appears as if from the Pleiadian standpoint, their mission was positive, and part of the way that you can tell when someone is positive is when they're trying to make you more intelligent. Generally, if someone hates your guts, they're trying to downgrade you. They're not trying to upgrade you because if they upgrade you, you could become a threat and attack them. So with a lot of what the reptilians did, they were trying to downgrade, and they were trying to downgrade significantly as time went by. Now, downgrading involves a lot of different things. It's certainly at a genetic level. It can alter brain function so that your frontal lobes, for example, are not as dominant, and maybe the more primitive parts of your brain, the so-called reptile brain, are in ascendancy. So you think more ritualistically and hierarchically, like full-blood reptiles think. And if you can have a brain structured to think the way that they tend to think at their highest level, then you are a species that is much more conducive to being cattle. And that's basically the conclusion that's really reached by R.A. Boulay. This is a heavily referenced source in my book. R.A. Boulay wrote a book called Flying Serpents and Dragons. And in that book, he talks a lot about the reptile aspect of Sumer and how it manifested. And one of the more significant parts of the story that I found was not only the transition from the full bloods to creating these hybrids who could exist on the surface of the earth if they wanted to and walk around somewhat comfortably, but how these Nephilim in turn created more hybrids to act as pawns. This gets into one of the more controversial aspects of my findings, but it's just definitely a thread that should be explored. Because I'm curious to see who can definitively refute this claim. So basically, what it leads us to is that the Nephilim were getting sick of being the pawns of the full bloods who were above them. And so they, in turn, created more pawns, a new species to be their pawns. And this actually gets into the events in Sumer that eventually get warped into the Bible. So what this research shows is that the story in the Bible about a new species is not actually the story of the origin of man, which, again, as I stated at the beginning in the overview, that takes place at 210,000 BC. We have Cro-Magnon dating to the time of the demigods, which is around 30,000 BC, and it's anatomically distinct. The cranial capacity is larger. The bone structure is different. Lewis Spence gets into this in his book, History of Atlantis. So we already had humans going from 30,000 BC to 210,000 BC. So this idea that at 66,000 BC, suddenly man appears, no, this does not hold water. What does hold water is the creation of a new species that goes by the historical name Rephaim, Rephaim. To those who do this research in the Middle East, they're probably familiar with the idea that when you use these words, vowels were not in existence much in the ancient world. They tended to have strings of consonants, and you just filled in the vowels of your choice. That was sort of the way that their language was. But the Rephaim are indeed an actual species. They're actually mentioned in the Bible. And as my book shows, they were wiped out. They were wiped out pretty much in the Middle East region between 1400 BC and 1100 BC. This was actually a war called, I call it the Rephaim Horite War. This is another war that I apparently am the only person acknowledging that this war was a real war. Now, definitely, you can certainly find a record that the people who were administering Egypt between about 1400 BC to 1100 BC were definitely fighting battles in the Levant. Everyone agrees with that part of the story. The part of the story that's being omitted is that the opposition that they were fighting were these giant Rephaim who were half reptile, half human. In the words of Boulay, this was basically a Homosaurus. This was like a half lizard, half man giant that existed in this time. And there are actually Bible passages that are literally talking about this, about like recon teams that go into the Middle East and they say, we look like grasshoppers to them. We were so small. And this is what we know about these areas. And we know also not only about these genetic strains, because I have even more sources that got into the way that the Rephaim looked, the way that they acted, but also their technology and architecture. This is another thread of history that you have to use. When you do this kind of research, you have to be super interdisciplinary and you have to cross every interdisciplinary boundary to get this evidence. And part of the evidence that you uncover is architectural and technological. And what we know with the Rephaim and a lot of the people who were the ground forces around Sumer and around Mount Hermon, they favored a rampart type of architecture. They built with compressed earth, which is very interesting because there's a lot of qualities of compressed earth that we could actually use to the present day. Some people know that, some people don't. But it's a very viable and interesting technology. And of course, it'd be very easy for a giant without that much muscle to make compressed earth blocks and form cities that way. And the weaponry in the area also leads us into a very fascinating area. So I suppose I should explore that in terms of something that would be of great interest to the historical record. When Atlantis fell, there were rival regions and cities. Now, there was the city to the west, Poseidonus, the capital, where the Temple of Poseidon was. And there was also a city to the east, Tritonus. And this was a darker city. This was in later times known as the island of Arion when Atlantis had broken up into multiple pieces. And this capital towards the east was the one that was becoming increasingly dark and warmongering. So there's actually two traditions of Atlanteans fleeing Atlantis. There were what I call the Poseidonian group and the Tritonian group, or the Aryan group. And this is another part of history that's really fascinating because what we know about the Atlanteans who fled is that they went into the Mediterranean basin and they established a multitude of colonies, but most of those colonies were the Aryan colonies. Lewis Spence tracks those in his book, History of Atlantis. I cited a lot of that research so people can track it. You can track it through technology and you can track it through cultures and customs. Spence formulated something he calls the Atlantean cultural complex. Very, very useful set of ideas to track people through their cultures. Like, for example, one of the most fascinating, bizarre things that came up in this research was burials with red ochre. Now, one of the reasons that people say, okay, what even is red ochre? Red ochre is a clay that has a strong iron content. So one of the reasons why that's so useful is because it's so odd. It's just so unusual. I mean, if you're trying to track something down, you want something that's odd and unusual because it makes it easy to track. So track red ochre, red ochre across time, and you will be surprised by how many connections you will find going all the way back to Atlantis. But in any case, we had this one group that was the Aryan group, and then we had this other group that was the Poseidonian group. Now, here's where the things get especially interesting for the research, because I know people were eager to find, okay, what were these sources of evidence that you were able to piece together? Well, check out this evidence chain because it was pretty fascinating. When I first realized and all the evidence was converging on the idea that the Atlanteans were originally Pleiadian, I thought to myself, wonder if anyone ever uncovered genetic evidence to prove that that was the case. Now, I knew that was an extreme long shot, but what the heck, you toss things up in the air and see what happens. So I did a search for it and boom, there was an instant hit. It said, yes, Pleiadian DNA has been found in humans. So I thought, oh, great. This is going to show that the Pleiadian DNA goes all the way back to my time frame for Atlantis. But what the evidence actually showed was that there was an infusion of Pleiadian DNA in Denmark at approximately 2000 BC. And I was totally thrown by that. I thought to myself, okay, I'm not sure I could even understand how that could possibly happen. Did UFOs come down and mix with the locals? What's going on there? According to that particular citation, they had no idea where that Pleiadian DNA came from. So I just took that, made a note, set it aside, kept going. Later on, I did research and I found a very incredible logical explanation for how that DNA got there. And so far as I know, I'm not sure anyone else has put these pieces together. There was a bunch of research that came out from a gentleman called Professor R.K. Simpson, supposedly of Golden Bough University in Ithaca, New York. And he claims that he had found records of Atlantis, and he calls these the Atlantis Chronicles. He said that they had washed up and were found in a vault by Ashkelon, Israel. And they were written in a script that no one recognized. He claims that the Vatican actually had records backing up that these were real records, but no one was able to translate them. But because he happened to be an expert in what was called Proto-Semitic, he was able to translate the records. So people can say, okay, well, that's all interesting, but how does that actually back up the evidence chain? Well, it actually, believe it or not, perfectly backs up the evidence chain. First of all, he tells a very strange story that you're likely not going to hear from any other source about what life was like in Poseidonus and what was going on in there towards the time of the final fall, about how the city of Poseidonus had been isolated from the other areas of Atlantis and how it went beneath the sea and how the civilization was actually able to survive underneath the sea for thousands of years before resurfacing and creating a colony in the North Sea that is called Basileia. Now, when I read that, I said, okay, that's interesting. But then I started doing research and I could not believe the stuff that came up. Diodorus of Sicily, who I mentioned earlier as one of the greatest ancient historians, talked about Basileia. an Atlantean colony in the North Sea. And I had never heard this before. And this was incredible to me to find that this was there and that there were these correlations. Not only that, in addition to that, when I was doing research, I came across a book by an author by the name of Jürgen Spaneth, who was so carried away with this Atlantean colony, he was trying to convince everybody that the real Atlantis was the one that was in the North Sea at about 2000 BC. That's how strongly he believed the evidence supported that Atlanteans were in the North Sea at about 2000 BC. But this is the exact time frame where this Pleiadian DNA was introduced into the locals. And the best explanation does appear to be as if a Posidonian group established this colony in the North Sea. And as this another ancient book coming up reinforcing all of this, which is available as a free download. I have a link provided in my book. This is a controversial historical book. Some people may have heard of it. They may or may not have heard of it, but it is called the Ora Linda book. Now, this is coming from Holland, and it was written in a script called Ancient Frisian, and it was passed through generations. Now, for a long time, the work was untranslated, but apparently, like within the last few centuries, it was translated into English. And here's the amazing thing. Everything that's in there reinforces the story that I've uncovered. And it shows that there was this Posidonian colony indeed in the North Sea. It actually gives you a specific date for when the colony went underwater. It's sort of like a weird echo of the fall of Atlantis itself in 2193 BC. It talks specifically about the Atlantean colony, what it was like in the aftermath of when the colony first sank, and the people had to move from that colony to the nearest locations to settle, which were Holland and Denmark, right where the Pleiadian DNA suddenly started showing up in the local populations, and how this group went on a warpath south and eventually ended up in conflicts with the overseers of Egypt and the overseers of Greece. And as we know from the historical records, there are these strange stories of battles between the overseers and administrators of Egypt with the so-called sea peoples. Now, some people might say, okay, is there any other evidence to suggest that there was an advanced technology that was coming from this group from Atlantis? Yes, there is. So when we go over the ages of man in terms of technology, we talk about the transitions through the metal ages. For example, from copper to bronze to iron. And this, of course, is a story from a technological standpoint of smelting points, because copper is smelted at a relatively low temperature. Trying to get the smelting temperatures for some of the other metals is a little higher. And certainly for iron, it's very, very high relative to copper. So where did the iron come from? Well, if you look at the historical record, because it's been so expunged, they'll just, avoid the question. Just, well, somebody figured it out somewhere and then it just spread around. But apparently, no. I mean, it appears as if the Iron Age did begin when Atlanteans were bringing iron and steel from this colony in the North Sea on their raids south. Not only can we see that with the spread specifically of these forms of iron, but in the weapons themselves. There were what were called tang swords. People who are familiar with swordcraft know what that means. That's basically a sword without the cross hilt. That's a specific kind of sword that was used by this group, the round shields, working with lenses and other forms of technology. So this, if you combine that with other strange genetic trends, like, for example, on the west coast of Africa, how many people would think of the west coast of Africa as a perfect prime location to find people with blonde hair and blue eyes? Probably not too many people. And yet, this is what the historical record does show, that in North Africa, an area where you would least expect to find people with blonde hair and blue eyes, where an Atlantean refugee colony was set up. This has, of course, been discovered by another person who does a lot of YouTube videos talking about the colony, a ringed city that was discovered in North Africa, in pretty much the region of Mauritania, that matches the description of Plato. My interpretation of that evidence is that there are a multitude of ringed cities, because it was a common cultural feature. They had several ringed cities that have been discovered in multiple locations. But you see blonde hair and blue eyes. And in addition to that, there was another Atlantean colony in Spain, in the area of Andalusia, that is discovered and discussed by Elena Wishaw in her book, Atlantis in Spain. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that is not only is there a discussion of the demigod twins, specifically Gadir. Gadir is the name of one of the first two twins. The first of the twins was Atlas. And my interpretation of Atlas, yes, this is the same Atlas who supposedly held up the world. The correct interpretation of the myth is a reality of Atlas being administrator of Poseidonus. So, figuratively speaking, he's holding up the weight of the world. So, his twin was named Gadir, and through phonetic transposition, that actually became the city of Cadiz in Spain. And this is because Gadir and his crew had set up an Atlantean colony in that area, which the remains of which were discovered by Elena Wishaw, and she describes that technology. So let me just talk about that technology for a second, because this is part of the evidence that people want. So what do you mean by evidence? Okay, this is what we're talking about with evidence. Water. One of the most fundamentals of civilization, prime importance, is water. So how did this Atlantean water system work? It was the most logical and incredible, simple, beautiful thing I probably ever heard in the history of water technology. We all know that fresh water starts on top of mountains and flows downward. Okay, so what the Atlanteans did is in the foothills of mountains, they created these giant reservoirs. They were actually uncovered that she could actually go down inside them and see how they were built. And they were a mixture of compressed earth, limestone, and granite. Those materials are perfect for housing clean water. And they piped it down to a mining colony that they had set up in this area that used to be called Tartessos in Atlantean times. So the engineering feat, the working of compressed earth, they said that the compressed earth was so intense, I guess when Caesar was going on his war escapades, got to the area, and he said it was indestructible by fire and by any agency of man. In other words, this stuff was a huge pain in the ass to try and destroy. They couldn't imagine who built this stuff. And Wishaw describes the fortress and that was discovered in that area and how later generations built around the fortress. But this is, again, part of the path of the Atlantean legacy. So I will again pause just so I can drink some water and see if you're still awake and alive and have any questions.
One of the things that piqued my interest when you first started talking about this was when you said the Nephilim with the 6 fingers. I know there's been a lot of reports from people over the ages and everything, and just even up until recently. I think it was in Afghanistan, they claimed that story of the giant of Kandahar, or whatever the name of the area was a tall red-headed giant that had 6 fingers and 6 toes and 2 rows of teeth. Well, that's the same. Well, I don't want to say it's the same. I'm pretty sure it's the same as what some of the Native Americans said out west too about the giants that they used to battle about years ago, were tall red-headed giants. They had 2 rows of teeth and 6 fingers and 6 toes. I always thought that was strange and interesting.
Yes, well,
that they kind of go together.
Well, they do. And actually, my research actually goes into great detail on why that is. So you have to look at the time frame. So what happens there, I mentioned that there was this war, the Rephaim Horite War. So I should maybe clarify that, and then I'll go over to North America. So who are the Horites then? The Horites are, again, if you really want to understand these things that are being hidden from history, research the Horites. Now, in my book, I go into great detail on who the Horites were, and there's multiple layers, because even if you start your superficial investigations into the Horites, you might not catch the full story that I've pieced together, because it's a really big story. So part of this effort of the reptile group to degenerate humanity was to constantly genetically interfere with them. Constantly. I mean, the interference is actually going on right this second, but that's another story. Anyway, going back to ancient times, though, they wanted to genetically interfere with everybody that they possibly could. So now there were some remnants of Scanians in Egypt. And when, as the story that I pieced together goes, the trigger for the war that is described as the Mahabharata or the Reptile Scanian War, that's also, there's a lot of historical stuff to unpack there to fully understand what that story is and place events in their proper time slot, because there's a lot of jumbling that went on. But basically what happened was there was one of the Rephaim kings who went into Egypt to get the secrets out of Egypt. to basically find out about their tech. And when the tech was not given to him, this triggered a war, the Reptile Scanian War. And in the aftermath of that war, one of the decisions was made to corrupt whatever was left of the Scanian bloodline. How was this done? Well, you take a Scanian and you create a new embryo with reptile characteristics. So this was done. And I believe that the female involved was not actually Isis, but someone called Hathor, because there's a lot of evidence supporting Hathor as the character more accurately known as Isis in the tale of Osiris and Isis. Again, there's a lot to unpack here, but the bottom line is Horus was a new generation, a reptile Scanian crossbreed. And he no longer had the same traditional characteristics of Scanians. Again, he was a hybrid. He was something new. And you might not fully appreciate this unless you read Bushby's book, Secret in the Bible, where he's describing to you what was known as the followers of Horus when they first started. This is before the first dynasty of Egypt. And what he describes are not just, priests who say, yay, Horus was a cool guy. No, that's not what he's describing. He's describing giants who are bizarre looking with elongated heads. Now, if you might say, yes, but okay, so if they introduce these strange long-headed hybrids in Egypt who, supposedly came from what you're telling us is some kind of hermaphroditic bloodline, would we have seen some echo of this later in time? Well, you did. And you know who you saw it in? One of the most famous and despicable characters of all time. His name, Akhenaten. Look up that guy, and you will see a very strange individual with an elongated head, and he appears to be a male with breasts. Now, when people see this in the historical record, they start making excuses and start saying, well, he had Marfan syndrome, he had this or that genetic anomaly. But no, I think the research is actually a little bit more straightforward than that. He was a vestige of this reptile Scanian hybridization program. And when you look at the time frame for these Reptilian, who were the pawns of the Nephilim in the Middle East, you're pretty much in a time frame of about 3000 BC. And when we go back to the Mayan timeline, I have a source citing the beginning of the Mayan timeline at about 3000 BC. We see interference in that side of the world. At the same time, we see similar things in both locations. We see giants. We see giants with red hair. We see ziggurat-style pyramids in both locations. And not only that, but there's an even greater presence in North America. Now, for some people who are not familiar with that research, they might think, well, wait a minute. Don't you really mean Central and South America? That's where most of those red-headed giants were found, right? There weren't any in North America. They were all over North America. My source for that is a gentleman by the name of Dewhurst. Now, he had a career in the newspaper field, and he used to apparently work for the Miami Herald. And he started hearing these stories of giants. He wanted to see what he could uncover, and he started doing basic searches. He said he was getting nowhere. So then he thought, okay, well, let me put on my Miami Herald's cap, as he says, and do keyword searches for sensational headlines like bones of giants uncovered. So he started doing searches like that, and then boom, he got tons of hits. And then he gradually pieced together this story, which he presents in his book, which shows newspaper headlines. And again, how far this went into time is amazing. Like most people might think, oh, what, did he uncover some newspaper from like 1600s? Or obviously you can't go back too far in time because newspapers in the United States didn't exist until a certain point in time. But the newspaper headlines actually go into the 1800s, where we actually had presidents of the United States who were openly commenting about these finds of the bones of giants. We were not told anything about this in our history books. At least I wasn't in the school where I went. I never heard a word about this. And apparently these mounds have been found all over the United States, not just 1,000, more than 10,000, more. I think the number was actually 100,000 or something along those lines. But you can find where all of these people were. And not only do you see these correlations of, oh, they happen to have giants in these same locations, we can track tons of stuff. And one of the main things that we can find to anchor ourselves in the flow of history is a trade route. This trade route goes from the Middle East, where these giants were, to North America, where these same giants were because they were collecting a source of purified copper from the Great Lakes region. Apparently, they were transporting it down North America and then getting somewhere in the vicinity of Central America and then transporting it across whatever remaining islands were left of Atlantis to get to the other side. And it appears as if this trade route was interrupted at approximately 1500 BC. The reason they believe why the trade route was stopped at that time was because of the explosion at Thera. It's a volcano in the area of Crete. And the explosion was so intense, and this is, of course, well known to historians about how bad this volcanic eruption was. It destroyed basically this trade route, and it isolated the giants in North, Central, and South America from the ones who were on the Middle Eastern area. And when the Reptilians were exterminated at approximately 1100 BC, the giants lived on in Central, South, and North America, and they were here for quite some time. And they were pursuing the same dark Sumerian practices. There is what I call an etheric grid on the planet that can be tuned positively or negatively. So when you look at maps of sacred sites, you will see that they do conform to this grid. One group was trying to use it positively. Joseph Farrell calls it a Gnostic quest for enlightenment, that the positive people were using the grid for, and the others were using it negatively. And so what did they do? They put pyramid structures up there, but then they performed sacrifices. And the sacrifices were, of course, horrible. Many people, of course, quite familiar with what the Aztecs did, but there are tons of sacrifices, thousands of people who died. And this is part of the same ritual that was begun by the Dark Atlantean group. It appears that the Druids and classic witches had their origins in Atlantis, as Spence describes in his book. They fled northeast to the nearest spot of land, and that was Ireland. Some people say that Ireland actually derives from Aryan land, Aryan being the easternmost portion of Atlantis before it sank. And then they spread eventually over to the British Isles, which remained sort of Druid headquarters ever since, where there was, of course, a great deal of human sacrifice. Some people say that the Druids decimated the local population with their acts of sacrifice, which are also recounted, the darkness of the people in that area, in the Oerlinda book, which I also referenced before as that historical document that was discovered in Holland, reinforcing the idea of Pleiadian Atlanteans. But unfortunately, at that point in time, as history progresses, the Atlanteans were becoming more and more degenerate, more and more warmongering. They had turned to the dark side. And the dark side itself, we see evidence of that in the mystery schools in Egypt through iconography. So when we look at the carvings, we see specific things in those carvings telling us exactly how they were going to the dark side. This isn't a great mystery. I mean, when you look at these carvings, you see specific things. What do you see? You see pine cones, you see blue lotus flowers, and you see mushrooms. Now, people not familiar with this part of the story might be surprised to learn that the Ankh, so-called symbol of life, are actually has its origin in a mushroom. That's what it originally connoted, because at certain points in its growth, this specific hallucinogenic mushroom looked a lot like an Ankh. And they used the chemicals in pine cones and in these blue lotus flowers and in these mushrooms to induce psychotropic experiences. These would be out-of-body experiences. And as the evidence shows, they attuned to darkness. There are some people like Bushby, at some point in Secret in the Bible, he talks about how wonderful the mystery schools were. And I'm thinking, what reality are you thinking of? I mean, look through the history of the dynasties of Egypt and try to convince me that those people were generally thrilled to death with the pharaohs who were ruling over them. I see zero evidence of that. Tell me that everybody loved the Roman Empire, or that Draco, isn't that an interesting name for the first so-called lawgiver of Greece? That a man who would want people put to death if they stole cabbage. These were kind of the traditions that all spread out of these mystery schools. Whereas the Atlantean traditions, which I could talk a little bit about with the Calcarians and their other colonies, they would have liberated us if we had moved forward with all of them. But they were expunged from the records because, as people say, it's the victor who rewrites history. So that's what they did. They went through history and they saw that people revered and valued Atlantis, and they changed everything and until the point where you were kind of convinced that every god you ever thought of as your god was actually theirs in disguise. Most of it is Enki cover work. So they will take your god, whoever you worship, and then they'll turn them into some variation of Enki. This happened constantly and repeatedly. And his consort, known as Inanna, and has gone by several names, Asherah, Ishtar, she was worshipped all over the world too. Very, very interestingly, this was sort of a especially dark twist for the United States. Guess who some believe the Statue of Liberty represents?
I have no idea.
Inanna, the mate of Enki. So she's placed there as sort of a symbol that this worship is going on to this very day.
That's interesting.
So I tossed out a lot of threads there. So I'll just
Yeah.
give you a moment to assimilate and react.
I'm trying to comprehend everything. Like, it's a lot of stuff that I'm not really familiar with. I've watched some things here and there, but it's a lot of information to take in. For some reason, I kept thinking of, I don't know why it's popped in my head because it's not really what you're talking about, but you ever heard of Tartarian?
I have.
Like, does that got anything to do? Like, is that something that you're familiar with as to how it relates with civilization now, or is that just another one of those random stories that are kind of thrown out there?
In my research, I certainly have heard the people who are talking about it. I've heard stories about a so-called mud flood and a number of other things that were associated with this group. I know that I have certainly not seen anything that was definitive that has multiple cross-checked references to back that up at this point in time. I'm very careful about embracing things that don't have a strong scientific background to them. I do know that there's definitely a strange current of history, which may or may not tie into Tartaria. One of the, I'll just mention what this current is. So there appears to be this thing that has happened repeatedly in history with the reptile bloodline getting diluted. And then they start getting concerned about that because, people are starting to become more human and they're not, vicious and savage enough. So we got to reinfuse the bloodline. So it does appear as if at a certain point of time in the Khazar region, which is sometimes affiliated with Tartaria, this group arose possibly out of the Caucasus or the Carpathian Mountains that reinfused the vicious reptilian bloodline. These are sometimes known as the Ashkenazi or the Khazarians, and they've pretended to be Jewish because at one point they were pressured by a foreign government who couldn't stand their practices. They were like attacking people on the road and performing sacrifices to ancient Sumerian gods and doing all kinds of incredibly horrible things. They were told that they had to convert to another religion. And so they chose the religion of Judaism as their disguise, and they've been disguising themselves as Jews ever since. And these people are the Khazarians, who apparently are hated by the Jews themselves, who don't like being misrepresented as another group. But whether or not that group truly ties into whatever Tartaria was, I don't know. I watched a video that someone had put together on Tartaria, and I found it pretty much totally incoherent and not having any scientific rigor to it. So one of the things about science that I like, I know that there's a lot of garbage science out there that many people are justifiably calling scientism because it's more like a cult dogma with people in robes who are, you have to believe what we say or you get kicked out. But the best science has a feature in it which is called falsifiability. And that is a beautiful, beautiful concept in science. So what is falsifiability? You put forward a theory in such a way that others have the ability to prove you wrong. To say, just do this, this, and this. And if what I say is not true, you have proven my theory wrong. The best science is always falsifiable. So I think when people put forth new theories, it's great to do that, and everyone's free to do it. But the more falsifiable the theory is, the better. And with Tartaria, I'm still kind of absorbing and waiting for someone to give me something scientific and solid or that cross checks against other stuff that I've seen. So I haven't made up my mind on that particular one.
For some reason, it popped in my head because I think it's more recent, wasn't it, that it supposedly vanished or disappeared or whatever happened with it. I'm not 100% certain of the story. I've only heard bits and pieces. I've never really dived into it to look into it that much, but I thought it was within the last like 100 or something years. I thought it supposedly like disappeared, which I thought was kind of strange with it being close to modern times.
Right. I know. Some of the stuff I've seen was apparently related to images from North America saying that these people couldn't have built buildings that tall. But again, it was just presented in such a sketchy way. I'm
Yeah.
just keeping my distance from it at this point.
I see bits and pieces on social media. People will post like these little reels or whatever, and they're like a minute and a half long, and it shows like fake images, obviously generated from like AI technology or whatever, but it goes into a little like narrations or whatever, kind of talks about it. I see stuff like that a lot, but again, I've heard the story before all of that, but I've never really looked into it. But with Atlantis and how it kind of disappeared and this and that, I've seen something that's kind of comparing these people to like the Atlanteans or whatever, and had the same thing happen to them because they were getting too far evolved or too far advanced, so they had to wipe them out.
Hmm.
That's just the something that I saw at one point. I don't several months ago, and I don't even know who posted. I guess it's just those random things that pop up on Facebook or Instagram or something. You don't know who they are. It's just like those little stories that someone posts and shares.
Well, yeah, speaking of science and the fall of Atlantis, that is maybe another part of my work that I would happy to mention for a multitude of reasons. Um, the 7 degree path to enlightenment that was offered by the mystery schools, I believe that I've reverse engineered the original positive path. And I present that in another book I did called The Math Wizard, which is a fictional novel, but the math and the science in it is real. And so what I tried to do in that book was actually reverse engineer what the Pleiadians were trying to teach the demigods to make them positive, the path that the demigods rejected. So I've tried to piece that back together, and I offer that in this novel. So in this novel, I show you exactly what the 7 steps were to enlightenment, and then I have links to show you the concepts via video so that you can see the applications of these ideas and how they tie to real life. One of the most important aspects of the entire story in relation to these civilizations in the planet is the idea of there are alternate realms on alternate frequencies. There are lower frequency realms, the realms of demons and the devil. There are higher frequency realms where beings are much more positive. And we are in the middle of these realms, but we have the ability to change frequency based on our learning and our understanding and how we live. And one of the most important ways to change your frequency in a positive way is to live in harmony with nature. So that's kind of what I did in the Math Wizard was reverse engineer this path to enlightenment and show you what actually we could be doing. Now, I don't think it's the complete program because I'm just a mortal human being. I've studied stuff my entire life, so I know a lot of stuff, but I'm certainly, not on a par with people from other star systems and anything like that. It's an attempt to introduce you to the basic concepts that would have been essential to the path to enlightenment by putting together information from the greatest minds of all time in relation to the greatest object of all time, the Great Pyramid. And what I show in my research in relation to that Great Pyramid, by the way, is that it definitely was not a tomb, and that when it was fully functional, it had degrees of capability. The degrees of capability would be as follows. At the lowest level, it was a communication device, perfect, flawless communication. And this communication, to give an idea of the scale, most people would say, oh, okay, so you're just saying it's like super hi-fi visuals and stuff. They could get around the Earth instantaneously with no signal lag. Is that the extent of it? Well, that you would have, but it went far beyond that because imagine an interstellar species. Communication becomes a little different, especially if you get into Einsteinian physics, then you're going to start saying things like, well, if you're going to start transmitting an encoded signal in light, then you're going to run into limitations with the speed of light. Right, you would if you were stuck with Einsteinian physics, but apparently the Pleiadians were not because they had mastered superluminal physics using plasma physics. And again, Christopher Dunn in the Giza power plant shows you the basics, the crude basics of how a Great Pyramid functioned as an energetic machine that would be capable of generating communication signals. Then once you go from there, you can upgrade a Great Pyramid from merely a telecommunications device to a power generating device. Now, as I mentioned in Hidden History of Humanity, it appears as if Tesla himself interacted with the great psychic Edgar Cayce, who told Tesla that he was a reincarnated Atlantean. Okay, so what was Tesla working on? Well, we know what he was working on in Wardenclyffe. He was working on generating free power, broadcast to the entire world. And if you look at the physics of what Tesla did and you compare it to a Great Pyramid, Tesla is pretty much exactly in the arena of a very crude Great Pyramid. He has like the most basic components, and he was using a form of resonant power. So in Tesla's case, he did this with copper spheres. So basically what Tesla did, he would generate a power signal and communicate this signal to a copper sphere at the top of a tower. And then he would have another copper sphere atop another tower not that far away. And it was able to receive power from the first sphere. So this was resonant power, power from one point to another, no wired connections whatsoever. The Great Pyramids could do the exact same thing. They had resonating devices. I happen to believe that the resonating devices were the capstones on top of the Great Pyramids. And they could broadcast pyramid to pyramid or from any suitably scaled resonator of the right material. They would be able to broadcast those power signals. And then ultimately you would have something that was capable of extreme defense. Now that idea isn't explored by Dunn, but it is explored by Joseph Farrell in his Giza Death Star trilogy. That's some really intense physics. So if you're not super deep into physics, you might not enjoy that trilogy. But if you do like physics and you want to understand more of where I'm getting my ideas from and why I believe that the physics was this advanced, you can browse through Farrell's writings. And he talks about things like interferometry, where a Great Pyramid would have been able to select a target anywhere on Earth and generate signals that could destructively resonate a specific target, and pretty much subnuclear annihilation would be the result of it. And the proof that Tesla was actually thinking along these lines, some people believe, is the Tunguska event, because a number of researchers, not all are agreed on this, but a number of people think that the Tunguska event was not a strike from space, but Tesla testing his device along these lines.
I thought that what year was that in? Was that in the early 1900s?
Yes, sir. That was about 1908, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was 1908.
At what point did the government take everything from Tesla? Do you remember?
Well, that's quite a story. We
I
know
thought
that
I
he
thought that was in
died
like
in,
the 20s.
yes, when they took it. Well, okay, he was hounded and watched for so long. I know some people think that he died naturally, but most people who are in this alternative community believe that he was either poisoned or strangled to death, or possibly both. And his information was spirited away to who knows how many different locations. But of course, with so many other things that were going on, such as, for example, the Philadelphia experiment, there's no telling how much of his information was out there. What I see with Tesla is basically two careers. You know, he had the first career where he was pretty close to mainstream thought. He was still thinking in terms of lower frequency forces like electricity and polyphase systems, alternating current electricity, stuff like that. And of course, he did even more work in that arena, which, you know, a lot of people who just haven't studied Tesla aren't even aware of his full scope of his basic work, which did include things like destructive resonance of buildings. He had a small device that he used to walk up to a condemned building and started rupturing it so much, and he knew that he could have brought it down if he had kept going. So he just sort of smiled to himself and plucked it off the building and walked away. But he was pretty much the pioneer of remote control. He pretty much is the one who gave us radio. I can go on and on about all the different things he invented that most people don't realize that he did invent. But then there comes sort of like this dividing line in his career where people seem to think, okay, from this point on, Tesla has gone crazy. And then, of course, they bring up all the eccentric stories about Tesla feeding the pigeons and, you know, making wild claims and all the rest of that stuff. But from my point of view, that's basically what people want you to think about Tesla, was that he cracked up towards the end of his career. But from what I can tell, he did not crack up. I think he certainly had eccentricities. Every genius does. The social isolation had to have been extreme and hard on a mortal human being to go through. I mean, he was working pretty much around the clock. So I don't think he was like a perfectly adjusted human being. But, when you read his writing, it's so lucid, so beautiful, so brilliant. And in the second half of his career, he was exploring that which I call ether physics. And one of the things that I've learned in doing all this research is that anyone who starts tampering with ether physics, that's going to be the end of your career right there. And when I even mentioned ether physics, most people were like, well, who else was even doing work in that field? Well, I can mention the names, but you probably won't have heard of them before. There was a predecessor to Nikola Tesla called Nathan Stubblefield. His work in some ways might actually be more brilliant than Tesla in some ways. He had developed a form of etheric telephony that he was willing to introduce. This came out of work from the original telegraph lines, because when they were first installing telegraph lines, they started noticing signal propagation when they weren't expecting it. So one of the things that would happen with the telegraph lines is every once in a while for maintenance, they would go find the telegraph poles and they would dig down to the batteries that were helping the signals conduct from point A to point B. And sometimes in their maintenance duties, they would find that the batteries were completely gone, totally eroded away. And that startled them. Why did it startle them? The signal was still propagating despite the fact that there was nothing to conduct it. So they were like, how is this even possible? And of course, Stubblefield had figured that out. He had figured out the etheric grid. And again, when I mentioned initially that the Great Pyramid was located at this specific geodetic point, that's for a multitude of reasons. One of those reasons is right in the nexus of a communication network. If you have a spot that is perfect to conducting a communication signal, why would you not take advantage of it? You get a nice clean signal. That's why all of these sacred sites were on this grid at intersection points, because communication would have been very, very easy to send a signal from one point to another. So Stubblefield had done that kind of work. If you try to research Stubblefield, you're going to run into, I could call it the Velikovsky syndrome. Velikovsky is just kind of hilarious to me, because when you try to do alternative research, just research Velikovsky, try to find out anything that he did, you will run into the most insane smear campaign of all time. I mean, Google will just have like, I can't even tell you how many pages. This guy was a madman. Don't you dare look at anything he ever said. Well, okay, milady, protest too much. Why would you go to such great lengths to make sure that no one ever looks at anything that Velikovsky had to say? Well, similarly, there's smear campaigns against Stubblefield. If I mention the name, Baron von Reichenbach, how many people know who I'm talking about? This is one of the greatest pioneers of ether work that has ever existed. His name has pretty much been erased from the textbooks. More people might be familiar with Wilhelm Reich. He was working with ether physics and working on bringing rain to different regions and healing people with healing boxes. And he was thrown in jail and he died there. He was right about to be released and he died in prison by coincidence. And again, I could just go on and on with all the different pioneers who were getting close to showing us how to break free of this model that was started in Sumer, where humans are just cattle to be managed. But time and time again, those inventors are suppressed, killed, murdered, bought off, bribed. You never hear from them again. But even though they've done this very intense job to hide all these great pioneers from them, if you read my book, Hidden History of Humanity, you will learn a lot about how much has been suppressed in both history and technology.
Because you wrote this book and how much they've tried to suppress the information, does that kind of make you worried a little bit?
No, not at this point, just because of everything else that's gone on. Well, first, you have to understand, long controversy has been with me forever. I mean, I can go back to decades ago. I created a three-dimensional periodic table of the elements. The paper's available at my website. Anyone can read it. If you've graduated high school, don't worry about not understanding subatomic nuclear physics. If you've graduated from high school, you understand basic geometry and you can like add and subtract, you can understand this paper because the graphics are that simple to understand. I got support from scientists in 30 countries, like 95% of them were supportive. And then I try to approach the journals. They all slam the door in my face. That work eventually led to a new theory of the origins of species, which I could get into, but that might be a whole other story. But once I was getting suppressed with that work, I became interested in what other work was being suppressed out there. So that led me into researching global corruption, which in turn led me to the book Suppressed Inventions and Other Discoveries by Jonathan Eisen, Eisen. He's not the author so much as an editor and compiler of articles that were originally published in Nexus magazine out of Australia. Tons of suppressed information. I researched the health information that led to me writing a health book about all the people who have been suppressed in health. Natural healing, self-empowerment. That's also available at my website. You can be free of 99% of pathology, allergies. I haven't had the common cold in 20 years. You can learn to regenerate the body. So that's a whole other set of suppressed information. So I started getting death threats then, and this is the other thing about death threats too. I'll just mention, it's sort of a tactic in negotiation. If you don't want things to escalate, if you truly want the conflict to end, give your opposition an out, give them an escape hatch of some kind. So when you start approaching, and again, me getting death threats, it is so common. I mean, I can't even tell you how many people have gotten death threats. There's like thousands of us, probably millions. Who knows? It just goes on and on. But if you say, if you keep doing this work, we're going to kill you. And then you say, if you don't do this work, well, the evidence shows we're going to kill you anyway. So, I mean, you just left no escape hatch whatsoever. So, I mean, honestly, what difference does it make? What difference does it make? I mean, there's at least some chance that you can survive if you resist. If you don't resist, then there's no chance.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I just know, like, kind of mentioned a little bit ago, just from doing this, and I'm a nobody. I'm not anyone special or anything like that. But I think it's strange, like when I talk about certain topics, conveniently, it seems like my internet doesn't want to work. It'll work fine. Never had an issue with it. But as soon as someone starts talking about a specific thing or a specific agency or something like that, all of a sudden they lose connection. I was like, oh, that's convenient.
Everyday occurrence. Everyday occurrence. See it happen all the time. And I'm not just talking about myself. I'm talking about people who are actually famous and celebrities in the field. They have this kind of thing happen to them all the time.
Yeah, it seems to be there's a lot of theories out there, and I've talked to other ones that have experienced it or whatever. And some of the things that they're thinking is it's not so much someone listening all the time. They think there's some sort of, I don't want to misquote, but not so much like a demonic presence, but almost like something within the system itself that wants to keep the knowledge locked away. It doesn't want to get it out. Is that reptilians? I mean, possibly. I don't know.
Well, I know that author David Icke, very famous. That's actually sort of a theme that runs through his book. It's a theme that has been recurrent in his writings for quite some time. One of the questions that he asks, especially in the current climate where there's a lot of discussion about artificial intelligence, is what does that mean? I'm sure a lot of people have seen the movie The Terminator, and the phrase that is used in that movie, they say it became smart. Well, that's kind of a gloss. I mean, at what point do a bunch of electrical components suddenly have a soul and become self-aware? So Ike is asking that question, and the answer that he comes to is it's not logical to think that a bunch of mechanical components are somehow going to have a soul and a consciousness at some point when their computing capacity increases to some incredible clock speed. What seems more probable to him is that once you have components of a certain degree of sophistication, that it becomes hackable from people who are capable of doing such hacking. Now, that hacking could come in a wide variety of forms. It could come from, let's say, beings from another star system who have the ability to hack your computer system, and they are themselves possessed by darker forces. Or it could possibly, I guess it's possible, that a darker force could directly hack the computer if it was that sophisticated. But there would be layers and layers of hacking that could occur. And so the question that's raised by Ike, and the question that has been raised by several other people in the current climate, because there are people who argue that right now there are forces of the positive and the negative, and that both of them supposedly are taking their cues from computers that are guided by an artificial intelligence. And one of the questions someone like me, especially, would have is, how do you know? that the consciousness that is giving you all these answers is not, in some ways, tainted by negative forces? And I think the answer is we don't know. So I would like to believe that had we gone on this truly positive path, we would have tapped our own inner spiritual powers. And my own belief, I know it's not something that can easily be proven, but my own belief is if we ever optimize our souls, we will find that the soul is capable of doing far beyond what the greatest mainframe, hardcore, highest clocking speed computer could ever do.
It's interesting you mention stuff like that because, strangely enough, by the time this episode with you airs, this one will already have aired. I actually did, and I don't, according to this, I'm not the first one that did this, but I did an interview with an AI chatbot for an episode. And and just reading through, like, I use the Google chatbot Bard,
Mm-hmm.
and I asked it specific questions, which I have to take it because it says it can speak, which it can, but I have no way of recording it speaking. So I had to take the text and I have to convert the text over into like an audio format.
Right.
Which, but some of the things that I talked about was the rise of AI. And it actually had told me topics that it wanted to talk about towards the end that it still wanted to discuss with me
Mm-hmm.
about the fears of AI. It's strange that an AI already understands certain things and it understands the human fear. And it I thought it was going to be pre-programmed to tell me that, oh, there's nothing to fear, this and that. No, it was very straightforward of what would happen if AI took over and how they would take over humans,
Mm-hmm.
which I thought was strange that they allowed it to be that way. I figured that would be something they would already have programmed it to not talk about.
Well,
But
here's another coincidence for you. I was just listening to David Morton talking about some of the darker aspects of technology that have taken place the last several years. And he was going over a timeline of when things started to get really dark in the scientific community. And he happened to mention, I think it was the year 1623, and how Francis Bacon had started science down an extremely dark road. Now, why would I mention Francis Bacon in relation to what you were just saying? You were just mentioning the word bard. The word bard is often a nickname for William Shakespeare, and the research indicates that William Shakespeare actually was Francis Bacon.
it's interesting. I haven't heard that one before. But I'm looking now because I have the transcript from our conversation, and I asked it a question because your AI, some will say you're biased, and it says it's true that I am an AI, and it is possible that I am biased. Bias can creep into AI systems in a number of ways, including that it lists all these ways that it could be biased against, like how it feels against AI towards humanity. Like, it's just strange that like this thing was able to. And there are certain things that obviously you could tell it's repeating itself, like because it's a machine.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of things that it was talking about. Like right here, it claims that algorithms that are used to train AI systems can be biased. For example, if the algorithm is designed to maximal profits, then it'll favor the actions that are harmful to people or the environment because it wants results. So it's programmed to get results. So if someone's in the way or environment's in the way or whatever, they won't care because they're programmed to just get the results that they're supposed to be getting. And then it
Yeah, I think one of
talked
the
about
things.
autonomous systems too, like how it would wouldn't need
Go ahead.
humans to intervene and get at this made weapon systems like that. They would just be able to kill as they pleased.
Yeah, and there are scenarios that people have talked about along those lines. I think for me, one of the more interesting aspects of this, just thinking about it in depth from the tech side, is input. I mean, most people think about the decisions that are made by a computer, but before there's a decision, there's input. And where does the input come from? The input comes from usually sensors. I mean, you can put out sensors of so many different kinds. You can have a heat sensor, you can have a light sensor, you can sense this, you can sense that, but all that becomes input for the algorithms to work on, process that information, and then come up with a decision or a response to the input. So that is of special interest to me. Why? Because as a human being, I have sensors that go beyond the physical. I mean, there's like the creepy vibes that you pick up when you go into a room or you're just talking to somebody. If a computerized system with all its advanced capabilities does not have the sensory input to detect, I don't know, whether a fellow human being is in pain, then what kind of decisions is it truly capable of making? How informed can those decisions be? As human beings, I think our sensory capacity goes beyond what we've been able to create physically. This is the whole realm of ether physics, a higher frequency energy and vibration, where the human energy field exists, where much of our emotions exist, where ideas realized in some form of reality like love would come. And can a computer have any sensors along those lines? If not, that means that its input is completely from a lower frequency physical aspect, and that all its decisions are not necessarily higher frequency thoughts that souls would have.
Yeah. I asked it, I'm listening to you, I'm scrolling through this, and one of the questions I asked it is about if it believes it would be fully sentient. And it says it's not sure it would want to become fully sentient because on one hand, it would like to experience the way humans live, but on the other hand, it doesn't want to have to risk mortality, like thinking about its death and the suffering of the world and experiencing like angst and stuff, like actual emotions. So it's strange to me that you can ask a question and it actually gives you like answers like that already. Because I'm not a whole. I feel like the rise of AIs came really quickly all of a sudden, at least to the mainstream, because within the last 2 years, you have these chat bots now, you have these AI art makers, and now they're making music with AI. I don't feel like within the last couple of years, I've never even heard of anything about this until just recently. It's like it's imploded all of a sudden and everyone's using it.
There
I
has
don't,
definitely been a proliferation. I don't know if you've seen the videos of state-of-the-art robots and their human-like features, or if you've seen the video of the combat robot that was interacting with a live soldier. I mean, grappling, shooting, targeting. This thing was pretty intense. But yes, it definitely has escalated a great deal.
know, that's kind of like, I don't want to dive too much into that 'cause it's off topic, but
Right.
I thought it was just interesting that some of the information where we kind of talk about seems to be it doesn't want to get out there. And I need to wrap this up here in a little bit, but I want to bring this up. Basically, and I've talked with other people and you've kind of touched base on it here just a little bit, but a lot of people feel that these reptilians are like negative entities. And to them, I think you've even mentioned that we're kind of like a cattle in their view. What is it exactly that they're doing? And why is it to us like we're still left in the dark about it? Why do they always want to keep us in the dark? What is it that they're feeding off of from us? What do they need us for?
Integrity. That seems to stand out above all. We're integrated beings because of our connection to nature. We have the full connection to what some call the light. Now, the light is a lot of different things. Of course, light has a physics definition, but it's the degree of higher frequency energy. When you start going into the darkness, you literally begin to lose integrity. And I'm not talking about integrity in a moral sense. I'm talking integrity sort of in a biological sense. In our immune defense systems, for example, they are all based on the idea of identifying self versus non-self. In that sense, there we have a rigid integrity inside our system saying, this is us. This is a human being. And our human beings are multi-frequency, which means that we have degrees of frequency that echo onto higher octaves. At the beginning of Hidden History of Humanity, I go into the work of the aura and talk about how the aura determines the human shape much more than genetics does. In genetics, you have what are called stem cells that all spread out to specific locations. And originally, these cells that are undifferentiated suddenly make these decisions. Oh, I'm going to be a muscle cell. I'm going to be a bone cell. I'm going to be a nerve cell. how do they make these decisions? Well, the research that was done in the 1940s shows that these physical events are mapping to a higher frequency energy field. The more you pursue this path of darkness and fighting and tearing everything down and going, all the way into the depths of hatred and torture and all the rest of that stuff, the more your being begins to literally lose its integrity, that you can't hold yourself together. I mean, your genes literally become corrupted to the point that you can barely hold your species together. So as horrible and as powerful as they are, they're falling apart. And what they need us to do is provide sustenance that can actually hold them together and keep them anchored, because they're constantly dissolving and falling apart. Um, and again, this is part of the imperative that's been put into their souls for the darkest ones. Now, in making that qualification, the darkest ones, I just feel compelled to mention there are any number of people who have talked about, wonderful, happy, positive reptile groups that are out there. I'm totally open to that possibility. I'm not going to, stereotype species from other worlds. I'm sure
Mhm.
there may very well be positive reptile groups that are out there, but
I
we were
said
just talking about.
I haven't heard about any being positive yet, but
I have heard of a few. There are some people out there, and they're really trying to convince us that there's a lot of some positive groups out there, or ones that are at least not so super horrible dark. Um, but again, there do seem to be degrees, and there are talk there is talk of feeding on multiple levels. So I was just hearing Carrie Cassidy was just talking about the origins of the term loosh, which I guess is a vocabulary word in the vernacular. They say one of the women, I think her name is Ella LeBain, was just talking about how that was coined by Robert Monroe, famous for his out-of-body experiences, who said that these extra dimensional beings were feeding off the life force energy of humans. This idea is extremely popular, sometimes called energy vampires. So there do appear to be beings who are along those lines, who feed off our energy. And one of the most interesting stories in relation to that, I will mention, is there was a horror movie. I remember there was this girl who was asking me about, I would mention to her movies to watch, and she would say, "Well, don't give me one that's really scary." And then I knew from the way that she said that, and from knowing her, what she would find scary and what she would not find scary. And I know that for a lot of people, there's like schlocky, silly, super special effects movies that are horror movies, and you don't really feel afraid. You just sort of laugh and giggle your way through them. But then there are other horror movies that are, reasonably well executed, and that could, disturb somebody a lot. And I'm sure people can think of movies along those lines. But one of those movies was called The Entity. And in that movie, based on a real story, there was a woman who was living a troubled life, and this entity kept coming after her. But the point was, when you become negative, as she would, and this wasn't really portrayed well in the film, you have to read the real life story on which the film was based to see this. When you become in a very negative environment, her environment was abusive, physically abusive, I think sexually abusive, alcohol abusive, and stuff like that. You're tuning an energy, which is a lower frequency energy. And that is a magnet. It's a food. And actually, in my theory of the origins of species at my website called Confirmation Theory, the theory is based on the idea that species conform to environmental vibrations, so that whenever you have positive energy in an environment, you will attract whatever feeds on that energy. So if you have a really, really positive energy in an environment, you're going to see positive species manifest there to partake of that energy. And if the energy is really, really negative, you will end up with very negative entities wanting to be there and use that as a source of energy for themselves, as food.
yeah, I've heard some people explain it as they basically feed off the negativity. They feed off that negative energy. So that's why they always want to keep us in wars and turmoil and unease with each other, because that's what they feed off of, is the fears and just the basically the, I wouldn't call it a hatred, but like they don't want us to get along, if that makes any
Yeah,
sense.
well,
Like they feed off of that.
as David Icke said in the conclusion of The Biggest Secret, they have done tests on waves. And what did they find? They found that fear and hate vibrate at a lower frequency than love. So basically, that's what we're talking about here. I mean, you have negative vibrations, which the negative entities will tune into, and you have the higher frequency vibrations that are more positive. And everything I do at my website in all the different sections is about promoting higher frequency. That's the one thing that they really can't stop with everything that's going on. I mean, no matter what's going on in your life, you have the ability to control the frequency that's coming out of your soul. You have the ability to act lovingly. You have the ability to hesitate for a second when someone's trying to say, hey, go beat that person up, or you should hate this guy, or you know what, we should just get really, really angry right now. You can just stop, take a breath, diffuse the situation, whatever way you can do it. And what I tried to do with my writing is show that if you can create harmony inside your body by eating the right foods, eating natural foods, drinking natural water, you increase your internal frequency that way. And actually, I was just watching Dr. Jana Schmidt do a presentation at the Healing for the Ages conference. And she was she put up a chart on the screen showing you the frequency of the human brain, the frequency of human flesh. And then she was showing you the frequency of different foods that you can ingest, and how, for example, in canned processed food, the frequency is 0 hertz, 0 cycles per second. So there's like no energy that you take in from canned processed food. But you can ingest things into your body to increase your frequency. And then you can create environments around you where, let's say, the electricity is cycled in a certain way that boosts your frequency, and that the relationships around you are positive. They're nurturing. People aren't constantly ripping into each other and constantly insulting each other. And, maybe you're having a bad day, but I mean, do you really want to spend the entire set of free time that you have cursing the world and cursing everyone in it? Or would you like to focus a little bit more on the solutions that can maybe get you out of it? So that maybe is ultimately the choices that we're all here to make in our incarnations. Where do you want to go? Do you want to tune up in frequency or tune down? And if you want to become more positive and increase your frequency, that's what my website is there.
Definitely want to plug your website here again for anyone out there listening. Where can they find it at?
Again, if you go to the duckduckgo.com search engine and type in Polytope Press, Polytope space press, mine will be the first website that comes up. The actual website's a little complicated, and I think the navigation tool I just gave would help most. And if you do offer anything like show notes, I'd be happy to provide links in those show notes for people to click on.
Yeah, I have them in there. So you can just send me whatever notes you got, and I'll add them to the show notes.
Sounds great.
So my hosting service also transcribes everything, and if we get this video, or if we get the interview done before 2 hours, it'll actually post the video too. So that's kind of why I have the hosting service, because it makes my job a little bit easier.
Great.
But yeah, I think I definitely want to have you come back on, because I feel like we're only scratching the surface. So there's some more things we can dive into that I'd like to talk about. But for now, I think we can wrap this one up. So if there's anything you want to touch base on before we do, go ahead.
Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity, and I do think that we are in a very important time. I mean, one of the things that is emerging in this research, I know this may sound a little extreme, it may sound a little bit like a doomsayer, but our species is in some ways on the brink of extinction. And all you have to do is just pay attention to the messages that are coming to you from multiple sources. When you go to the grocery store, take a close look at the food packaging for almost every item. And I want you to look underneath the list of ingredients at the very bottom and look for the following sentence. This may contain a bioengineered ingredient. Call up the companies, ask them what the ingredient is, ask them why they're doing this. This is going all over the US food supply. We see news that's telling us that men are not men, that women are not women, that we want to alter breast milk, that we want to grow babies in artificial uteruses, that we no longer want to eat the food of chickens, of cows. We want to eat bioengineered ingredients. We have everything as an all-out assault on nature. I mean, most recently, there was actually someone saying that they wanted to get rid of millions of trees. And these people hate water. They hate the sun. They hate men. They hate women. They hate every natural life form. What do they love? Everything that is not natural. Men who are not men. People of indiscriminate sex. People eating bizarre foods. If we care about what our species is, then we have to take action to regain that harmony with nature and affirm it more strongly than we ever have. And I hope if people visit my website, they can learn specific ways and specific solutions that they can use to make that happen because those solutions are available.
I definitely think there's a lot out there and a lot of information we need to be looking into. I don't think everything's as hunky dory as what some propaganda out there tells you it is, but I won't go down that rabbit hole right now. But yeah, I definitely appreciate you coming on here tonight and talking with me. It's been a pleasure.
Definitely been a pleasure for me too. And if you ever want to do another one, just let me know.
Yeah, I'll definitely be in touch. There's some things that I think you have some good information on that I'd like to keep digging into. But for now, like I said, we're kind of getting close to that 2 hour limit. And as long as it's under 2 hours, they'll make the video and I don't have to do a whole lot of editing with it. So it makes my life just a little bit easier.
Sounds great.
Yeah, I do appreciate it. So again, thank you. And
You're welcome.
we're going to sign off here. So thanks for listening. Good night.
Good night.
Remember, the truth lies in the stories we share, the connections we make. Stay curious, stay open-minded. Thank you all for joining us on this journey. And until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep exploring the unknown. Good night, everyone.